Now to the statewide results on the proposed constitutional amendments. There were 10 of them altogether, mostly housekeeping type items, but there were a couple of standouts.
Our Taylor Alanice here now to show us how it all turned out. Taylor?
Joe, Leslie, voters across Texas said yes to 9 of the 10 proposed amendments to the state constitution. But the first one, Proposition 1, which would allow municipal judges to hold more than one office, 35% of Texans voted yes and 65% voted no. For Proposition 2 on water development projects in economically distressed areas, 64% of voters said yes and 36% voted no. On to Proposition 3, giving local governments power to exempt property taxes in disaster areas. 86% of voters said yes and 14% said no. Proposition 4 on the state income tax ban, 77% voted yes and 23% voted no. Now on to Proposition 5, which would give sporting good taxes to parks and wildlife. 87% voted yes and 13% voted no. Proposition 5, which would increase cancer prevention funds. 64% of voters said yes, 36% said no. 73% of voters here said yes to Proposition 7, which would increase state school funds. 27% voted no. That's across Texas, of course. 76% of voters said yes to Proposition 8, creating a flood infrastructure fund, and 24% voted no. Now, when it comes to Proposition 8, the precious metals tax, 54% of voters said yes and 46% voted no. And lastly, on Proposition 10, which would allow law enforcement handlers to keep their canines, 94% of Texans voted yes, while only 6% voted no. Now, these numbers are still coming in, but roughly 90% of all of the counties have reported, and here in Nueces County, voter turnout was just over 8%. Joe, Leslie?
All right, Taylor, thank you so much.